So this interview is part of a larger project I'm working on, really trying to explore why it is that Canada has fallen from third to 46th in e-government rankings. And it's something that's a question I've been wrestling with for a while that I feel personally responsible for to a certain extent, because I worked for the government on digital transformation during this period of time. So I want to do some digging to figure out what actually happened, what could we have done differently, and where's this all going. So stay tuned. The video is going to come out at some point in the future. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this interview I just did. Well, welcome, Ryan. Thank you for being part of this giant experiment of mine to explore e-government rankings in Canada. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you about this because you know more about this than probably anyone else I know, particularly within the Canadian context. So ever since this idea popped into my head, I've been wanting to talk to you about this, partly because I also think this is partly your fault, Ryan. You were heavily involved in the digital government space. And so in many ways, the question that I've been wrestling with is what have we been doing wrong? Why are we falling? But before we get into that, I should probably give you a chance to introduce yourself.
I was going to say your thesis question is, well, how did Ryan screw up digital government in Canada?
That's
right?
the title of this video is what Ryan did to ruin it.
I love that. So I love that. Thanks, Derek, for having me on. It's always nice to be on this side of the podcast, Mike. As you know, and certainly as some folks listening might know, I run a podcast called Let's Think Digital, where we talk about a lot of issues, including this past season. We've been exploring this exact issue of why Canada has been dropping so much in some of the international rankings. For folks who don't know me, Ryan Androsoff, I'm based in Ottawa, Canada. I actually quite recently have stepped into the role as Vice President of Learning and Leadership for the Institute on Governance, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based here in Ottawa. We work with public servants at all levels of government, kind of helping them to upskill and modernize for the current era that we're in and the challenges that we're facing. I also have a company called Think Digital, where we do work with governments on digital modernization. And previous to that, I had been in the public service for a number of years, working in the federal government on a number of kind of digital modernization initiatives, the last and probably most infamous of which helping to launch the Canadian Digital Service Team, which I'm proud to say is still going today.
Yeah, unlike the Ontario Digital Service, which we lost in the last year. And maybe that in some ways sort of helps provide some context. So the big question that I've been wrestling with, that, like you said, that your podcast, which definitely check out, has been wrestling with as well, is, 2010, we were third in e-government rankings. As of 2024, we are 47th. And my big question, I guess, to start things off is what's happened? Why have we gone from third to, I guess, a drop of 42? No, 40, yeah, 45.
44 places, yep.
In 15 years, in 14 years. In 14 years where both of us have been on the ground trying to make a difference on this. What's going on?
You were joking about feeling responsible. I joined the public service in 2010. So I came into the office of the Chief Information Officer for the federal government in the summer of 2010. Right, I remember that, I think it was that fall, though those ranking came out that we were third in the world. And ever since Ryan's been involved, it's just been a steady slide down to where we are now.
So what did you do, Ryan? What have you been doing to undermine our growth?
It's so in all seriousness, I think a couple of things in context, right? So you're talking about the United Nations e-government rankings, which is put out. It goes back about 20 years since it was early 2000s, I think, when they first launched it. That might have been 2003 was the very first edition.
2003 is the first year for it.
Yep. And they essentially release it every 2 years, and it's an index that looks at three kind of primary areas, if I remember right, of kind of what they consider to be, e-government maturity. E-government's kind of a dated term, what we might call kind of digital government maturity today. And I will say that I think a couple of things happening, right? One, so certainly in the early 2000s, Canada was kind of widely seen as a world leader in e-government. Not just the UN rankings, Accenture had one, there was a bunch of other famous ones out there. We were always kind of in the top three. And that was coming on the heels of what was called Government Online, which was this big initiative by the federal government, launched in kind of the late 90s, went into the early 2000s. And it was really the first big push. Mid-1990s, this internet thing was new. First government websites were kind of going online. I think the first Canada.ca website was actually 1997. And so for the first time, governments were like, hey, there's this new World Wide Web thing out there. People are starting to go onto it. We should have a presence. And so there was a big investment by the Canadian government. I mean, over that 5-year period, it was about $1 billion in today's money that was spent on government online to take all the top services information and put it online. And so, again, there was just a real mobilization. There was a lot of kind of political will behind it, frankly. And I think, we saw the results that Canada kind of jumped up to the forefront really quickly. And so I think that 2010 kind of peak in the UN e-government rankings was frankly kind of, going on the momentum of what had been happening in that decade earlier, right, to get us there. Then I think what ended up happening in my view, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, and we can dive into it, is we kind of got stuck. And it's not that we got worse, but it's that the rest of the world started accelerating faster. I mean, if you actually dive into the numbers of that UN government ranking and go into kind of the dashboard, and if folks go look at the website on the UN government report, there's actually a dashboard for each country, so you can kind of like pull into the numbers and dig into them a little bit more. I mean, what you'll see is our score in 2024 is essentially the same score. I think we've moved up like a fraction of a point from where we were in 2010. So like the story it tells is we've just kind of stayed the same, and the rest of the world has modernized a heck of a lot faster. And like we can unpack a little bit of why I think that is. And, intuitively that kind of feels right because, I'm open to kind of hear some exceptions on this. So I think you've got the scores and the breakdown there in terms of what it has looked like, over the years, right? And yeah, you can kind of see that Canadian score has just been pretty flatlined over the course of the last 2 decades, and the rest of the world has been, catching up pretty quickly around that.
Well, and what's interesting about when you look at the dashboard here is 2010, which is sort of that high watermark for us. Our ranking is 0.84. As of 2024, our ranking is 0.85. And it's been, like you said, it's basically been a flat line. So we're actually higher ranking wise than we were in 2010. But to your point, the rest of the world is caught up. So I guess the question that comes to mind for me is what caused us to freeze? And I guess part of it for me is like, I mean, you were on the ground floor with this much more than I was, but being there, like, there's some big things that we launched. I mean, you mentioned it. The Canadian Digital Service was launched in 2017? That was a big step. That was a big step for us.
It was, but I will say the Canadian Digital Service was launched in part as a response to us being stuck. Like it wasn't that the Canadian Digital Service was like everything is great and we're going to do this now. I think it was having been in the room, so to speak, at the time, it was very much an ethos of, Trudeau government came in late 2015. There was a lot of discussions around like we're not doing as well as we should be, and hopefully this is a jump starter to get us making some progress, right? So I actually think the Canadian Digital Service was a response to the problem that we were seeing already back then that we just weren't modernizing. Because I was going to say, like, if you think back to your experience doing online government services in 2010, 15 years ago, I would kind of struggle to actually point to how the user experience is better or different today than it was back then.
So, okay.
And I'm sure there are examples, and I'm open to it, but just grosso modo, in writ large, I kind of don't think, we haven't made those big moves. And here's why. So, Derek, maybe to kind of unpack this a little bit. Like, to me, one of the core things, the biggest thing that I think we have not done well in Canada is we haven't focused on what people are calling digital public infrastructure, right? That infrastructure layer that I think the countries who are doing really well that we point to, you can pick the Estonias or the Singapores or the Denmarks, or even the UKs with a bit of an asterisk to some degree. They've really invested in building that digital public infrastructure layer. And people will kind of normally say that has a couple of components. There's different kind of, visualizations of what DPI can look like. But normally it's about, online payments, so the ability to send payments online. There we're pretty good, actually. We've got Interact. Government's had an online payment system for a while. Actually, Canadians have better online payment systems than Americans do, for example, right? So I think that piece is okay. We have the infrastructure to send money securely online. connectivity and the ability to have good internet bandwidth across the country. That's actually something we notice in the UN rankings we tend to lag on, right? Because Canada's got so big diverse country. I mean, up until the very recent advent of high speed satellite internet services, I mean, in the north or remote communities, it was tough to get anything beyond dial up speeds. I mean, that is changing, but not as fast as it should. And we still have a lot of people who are underserved. And we have incredibly expensive telecoms in Canada, right? Like our telecommunications cost, per gigabyte is, I think, the highest in the world, or certainly one of the highest in the developed world. So we do struggle a bit there. But then the big one is digital identity and digital credentials. We don't have a national kind of digital identity system. We don't have a national kind of back end on the data exchange layer, which is the big secret sauce in, the Estonias of the world and a lot of European countries and a lot of Asian countries. Now, I mean, I think including in South America and Africa and around the world. I mean, India has put a huge investment into biometric identification over the last decade and has jumped from a place where they used to have hundreds of millions of people who were completely undocumented to now having, world-leading biometric verification. And that's, I mean, in my mind, that's the big gap, because if you want to get to the world of integrated services for citizens in a digital world where it's kind of seamless. You can work easily between multiple jurisdictions. You don't have these kind of artificial boundaries between departments. If you want to start getting into proactive services where people don't have to necessarily apply, but it's actually, we say, hey, we know Derek is eligible for this service. We're just going to kind of push it out to him. You can't do that unless you've got a digital identity system of some kind in the back end. And I think, our approach in Canada has been to take a federated model, as we tend to do with everything in Canada, right? And that's been kind of the policy mantra coming out of Treasury Board and the federal government for, when I joined government in 2010 as a public servant, I mean, we were talking about federated digital ID back then, and the policy work was happening. What that's led to, though, in practice is it's kind of up to the provinces on what they're going to do, because in most cases, it's the provinces who hold the identity registry for most people. And so British Columbia particularly stands out. Alberta a little bit as well, as having actually made some real progress. I mean, I think BC is the leader, I would say, on digital ID in Canada. And there's now a pilot where, for example, like with your CRA services, you can use your British Columbia digital ID to access CRA services. And so we're starting to see some integration, but that's it's fits and starts, right? And there hasn't been any political will to say we're going to have kind of a common approach and standard and system for the whole country. I really do think until we get there, it's going to be tough to build the kind of modern digital services that people are coming to enjoy in other places in the world.
Well, it's making me think of who else I should talk to about this, because there was you alluded to it, the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework was set up as a way to create a common approach to digital identity and digital credentials across Canada. My understanding is it's kind of fallen apart due to disagreements of approaches between, in particular, between BC and the federal government, because they've taken two very different approaches. And full disclosure, I was part of the team that was working on the digital credential side of that for the feds for a couple of years when this was sort of rolling out. And I remember seeing the early hints of that friction between two of the leading groups within sort of that coalition. But it'll be interesting. I mean, Tim Boma is someone I should probably reach out to and get his thoughts on it. And Joni Brennan are two of the people who've been really driving that conversation.
And they've been involved since, they were involved in the early days, right? Like 15, 20 years ago when some of the policy work on this was being formulated.
Yeah, it amazes me that we haven't moved further on this. It's not a secret that this is sort of really important.
No, and I say this next comment, and it's not throwing shade on anybody who's worked on this, because I think a lot of people, including ones you've mentioned, have in very good faith put a lot of effort in to try solve this very difficult problem to solve, actually, like given, again, our political structure. But to me, like the digital identity thing, ever since I got involved in this space, has been like the Charlie Brown, like the Lucy and the football in Charlie Brown, right? Where it's like everybody's like, we're almost there. And the football keeps getting pulled away at the last minute. And it seems to be this very intractable problem. And I'll be honest, I think part of it is it actually really needs political will to be able to happen, right? Like this is something where elected officials have to be willing to kind of put a line in the sand and put some muscle into it. And what's really tricky now is I worry that we kind of missed our window a little bit a decade ago, because it's become a political issue now, right? So digital identity on kind of the far right wing has become, and arguably maybe on the far left wing as well, has become a big topic of conspiracy theories. This is, if you go online, I mean, I see signs in downtown Ottawa on the corner of Rideau and Sussex, like protesters being like, World Economic Forum, digital ID, Big Brother, right? Like this has become a mantra that this is, a way for government to control us. I would actually argue, in the experience we see in countries like Estonia, is it's actually the opposite. If you have a well-run digital ID, it actually empowers citizens to know what data about them their government has. Because right now, government's just a black box. Like, you could file some ATIP requests to find out, but like, you have no idea, I have no idea as a Canadian citizen what information government really has about me and what it's doing with it. Versus countries like Estonia and Denmark and others, you can log into your portal and not only see all the information government has about you, but the latest transactions and which public servants have looked at your data last and what they did with it, right?
Well,
like that's mind-blowing to, I think, a lot of folks here in kind of, Canada, but also like the US and a lot of other North American countries, North American, Australia, New Zealand, others. We haven't gotten to that level of sophistication around it. And just on the political thing, because this has become such a big like political conspiracy theory topic, I mean, there's at least 2 examples in Canada of provincial governments who abandoned their digital ID programs because of this, right? Saskatchewan and Ontario. Both in the last few years, they had, and I think you and I probably both know people who were working on the teams in those provinces that were working on, I think, promising digital identity, digital credentials approaches for those provinces so that they could have a province-wide system. And the premiers of both those provinces made the decision to pull the plug, in large part because kind of the right-wing side of their parties were like, this is Big Brother and we don't want to touch it. That's super disappointing, right? And so I worry that not only do we have all the technical interjurisdictional squabbles to deal with, but now we've got this kind of political conspiracy theory piece that we have to kind of combat as well.
Yeah, I remember there's something the team I was on, actually spent a lot of time thinking about the comms on this and how do we talk about this in a way that doesn't get people thinking about sort of Big Brother government. It's interesting. I was just having a chat with Yogesh about this. I mentioned who's based in Singapore. They have high trust in their government, which is one of the things that enables them to do a lot of the stuff that they do. The people just trust the government. And to your point, they've set up systems that actually empower their citizens with their data. There's ways of doing digital identity that actually puts the power in the hands of people, that you control your own data, you control your own identity, and then you give access to the government to this. And the thing that always blows my mind is, like, who do you trust more, government or the private sector? And to me, It's always been a no-brainer. I mean, government has lots of faults. I mean, I've dedicated my life to trying to find a way to sort of address some of these faults. But fundamentally, it exists for the people, by the people, and there's an accountability mechanism in place to enable that through elections and other things. Whereas the private sector is very much about making profit for shareholders. Like, that's why it's structurally is how we've designed it. And yet, we seem to be more comfortable with giving our identity and giving our data to private sector companies, and that's always...
I might, but and I think you're right. And I think government is held to a higher bar than the private sector is.
Yeah, which it should be.
And I might offer 2 things on this, right? And the first is, a point that actually David Eves makes often. I've heard him talk about this, which is, listen, unlike the private sector, government can choose to throw you in jail and deny you of life and liberty, right? I mean, we give kind of, I mean, our whole kind, if you get into like the political philosophy of government, I mean, government, we kind of give the monopoly on violence in society, right? On legitimized violence. And like, so at some point he's like, yeah, you should have a much higher bar on government because, it can actually decide to like seize your assets and throw you in jail if things really go sideways. So, we want to hold government to the highest standard in a way that the private sector can't kind of harm you if things go really badly, right? So that's one on kind of what I'll say the political philosophy side of it. The other on a very practical side is I think for a lot of people, they're not thinking about that when they decide one way or the other. I think it's actually a much more basic. I think people are willing to trade privacy for convenience or trade their data for convenience, right? And I remember having this thought, probably 20 years ago in the early days of social media, where on the one hand, people were really reluctant around, sharing data with government, but yet everybody was willing to sign up for a Facebook account and put all their personal details on there because it was, it solved kind of a social problem for them, right? And it was fine from that perspective. And I actually think again, that lesson from some of the countries we've been talking about is that government hasn't made a good case to say, like, if you let us kind of build some type of digital identity or credential system that you are part of, you're going to get better services. Like I actually, and that's we had a chance to do a deep dive into Estonia with some of the folks who were in town here for Forward 50 in November on the podcast, and that was one of the big things they said is like, listen, people didn't trust government in Estonia either. Certainly when they got going 20, 30 years ago on their digital government journey, but they just said, we're going to incrementally make things better for people, and as people see, okay, yeah, I get better services, I get faster services, I get cheaper services, maybe my taxes can go down because we're not spending as much on overhead. But people are like, sure. I mean, I think if you could actually prove to people to say, listen, by doing this, we can lower your taxes, get you faster service, you won't have to wait in line for a week to get a passport, et cetera, et cetera. I think people would actually be very willing to do that, but I don't think government's made the case at all that it can do that, and we seem to be struggling with like providing very basic things, and I think people then rightfully, in a kind of a rational way are saying, man, if you can't do the basics right, like why would I trust you, with my sensitive data in this type of way? Like they are more willing to trust the banks, for example, than they are government right now, and that's I think that's the corner that we've painted ourselves into, certainly here in Canada.
Yeah, there's a quote I heard at an event I was at a year ago. The whole idea of trust is delivery. That if you deliver, that's one of the ways that you build trust. I mean, I do think it's a bit more complex than that, but I think there's truth in that. One of the reasons why government has low trust, and the trust across government, like I think a lot of what you see happening, like last year with the elections, of this huge push for against incumbency, was really about people just not believing that government was delivering anywhere in the world.
100%, right?
And I
And
think
you're
that's
seeing
really
that, I
much
think, with what's happening now with Doge and Musk and, Office of Government Efficiency, where, they're doing some big cuts. And I think there's a lot of people who are just like, good. Like, we think all of it's bad. We think all of it's inefficient. We think all of it's corrupt. Get rid of it all. I think it's going to be short-sighted. I think people are going to, at some point, you kind of cut too randomly and too deeply. But listen, even in Canada, like, I think we are due for a rebalancing, right? I mean, we haven't, listen, COVID happened. We had a huge pandemic where we had to respond to it. I think Canada fared better than most countries in terms of weathering that storm. But our solution to essentially every problem was just throw more people at it. And there hasn't, we haven't had a real discussion in, I would argue, decades about, like, structurally, do we actually need to rethink how government works? And if we don't have that and we don't do it, you kind of build up this pressure that then leads to things like, Musk and the Doge Brigade kind of like ransacking through government departments in the States, right? Like, I don't agree, and I'm kind of disappointed with how they've approached it. But the idea that we should make government more efficient, I actually think there's, pretty overwhelming support for that in the population, right?
And within the public service.
And within the public service. Most of the people probably listening to this, public servants, like us, who were like, hey, we got to modernize this place. We got to make it work better. And I guess the point is, if people don't see anything visibly happening towards that end, like at some point, they'll just be like, enough. Like, and then all bets are off in terms of what happens.
Okay, so to sort of summarize where we've come to with this, so the question of like, why did Canada drop so much in the government rankings? What we've talked about and what we've seen with the graph is that it's not that we've dropped, it's that we've plateaued and the rest of the world caught up. The question of why did we plateau, and it sounds like in many ways the reasons that we plateaued is that we couldn't figure out the foundational things needed to take that next step with digital government transformation. And a lot of that came down to just the complexity of the fact that we're a federation, so you got to get the feds and the provinces on board, and then also a lack of consistent political will to drive that forward. Does that seem like a good assessment of
It is. I'm going to add two more things, maybe, if you don't mind, to the list
No,
from my
please.
perspective. So yeah, so you picked up on. So we talked about the digital public infrastructure. We've talked about, I think, needing sustained political will, which has been, I think, lacking. I think digital is largely viewed as unsexy, and people don't want. And there's been some exceptions, people like Scott Brayson and others, who I think have been political voices. I mean, Terry Beach right now, who's Minister of Citizen Services, but there hasn't been kind of top level sustained political will around this, and certainly not a cross partisan consensus that I think you have to have, and which you see in some other jurisdictions that have really made progress. But my two other things maybe is one, a bit of a cultural issue. So I think Canadians, our Canadian niceness, we always want to seek consensus on everything. And I think what that ends up doing is it just bogs us down in our ability to actually take decisive action. And I think that's been just a little bit of a challenge, right? Is sometimes there are trade-offs to be made if you're going to make some of these big leaps. And I think we seem unwilling, again, without that political direction to push us. Certainly the public service itself seems unwilling to kind of get beyond everything by consensus model, which I think slows us down in our ability to make progress. And listen, we haven't until recently had a burning platform, right? I mean, some of these countries, Estonia, people have been looking at Ukraine as being a real digital government standout in recent years. I mean, they quite literally have a burning platform on their borders, right? They've got conflict, they've got wars, they've got economic crisis. Those can actually kind of push you forward. And right now with the state of Canada-US relations, maybe we are going to have a bit more of a burning platform to say, business as usual isn't going to cut it. So that's I think one piece of it. Go ahead, Derek, and then
Well, I was
I'll
going to
give
say,
you my other
we had a
piece.
pandemic, though, right? A pandemic was a burning platform.
It was, and I had this like silver lining hope that 'cause we saw during the pandemic, right? We were able to move to remote work in a more flexible workplace and workforce. We were able to quickly respond on things like CERB and some of the benefits packages that got rolled out in record time, including those that had a kind of a digital aspect to it. But it seemed to be it was viewed as the exception, not the norm. And I've certainly been hearing consistently over the last year or two, it's just been backsliding into like business as usual, right? And that's
Yeah.
disappointing to me because as the old adage goes, never waste a good crisis. And I feel like we had these hints of like, hey, when you kind of get rid of the usual rules, you can actually accomplish some very interesting things. May not be sustainable on a human level. You got to think about how to make that work so people aren't burnt out all the time, but we didn't actually try harvest any of those lessons. We just kind of we're like, okay, well, let's go back to the way things were as fast as possible. And that's kind of disappointing. And maybe this goes to my last point, Derek, that I wanted to make, which is I think the other thing we face in Canada is a relatively insular public service, particularly at the senior levels of it. And when you look at us compared to other countries, I mean, the U.S. system, for all of its flaws, one of the interesting things about it is on the public service side, they do political appointments fairly deep into the org structure. There's, I think, somewhere around 8,000 positions in the U.S. public service that are actually political appointees. And so what that means is, yes, it can cause a little bit of chaos, but it also means every election you get this kind of rejuvenation of new blood coming in to kind of senior levels of their public service. Whereas here, I mean, all the way up to the deputy minister level, most public servants are lifelong public servants. They've spent, 30 plus years kind of in the machine. And the benefit of that is kind of, our peace, order, and good government approach of stability. They know the system well. They've got kind of deep lived experience. The downside is, you've got kind of a certain way of thinking about it. And again, back to this consensus point, if everybody around that senior leadership table are all good friends with each other and have known each other for 30 years and come up, through the system together, just on a human level, it actually kind of makes it tough to push big radical change, right? Because there's a lot of kind of both institutional and I would argue even human incentives not to kind of rock the apple cart. Whereas if we had a bit more of a permeable kind of leadership cadre within government, I think bringing some new blood in on a more regular basis might shake that up a little bit too.
So I know you have to go in shortly, so I have one final question for you. Looking forward, so that next time when you and I get together and say a year or two from now to have the same conversation, we're talking about how Canada's gone from 47th to, I don't know, 30th or 10th or maybe back to third. What is the one thing, the most important thing that if you're in a position of, say, a Terry Beach or whoever the next minister is to be on this file, what is the one thing that Canada needs to do to move up the rankings?
So I think we've got to get the digital credentials and digital ID piece solved. Like to me, that is the missing piece of the puzzle that we've got in Canada that a lot of other things are dependent on to be able to move forward. And that's going to require, listen, we've got an opportunity. I mean, we're going to have an election in Canada this year. What could be as early as March, it could be as late as October, but sometime in the next 6 months, in the next few weeks, we're going to have a new prime minister for sure. We may have another new prime minister, a few months after that, but we've got political change happening. And I think regardless of party, whenever you have a new mandate starting, that is the window when you can do big, different things. And so I always think these are, people worry about kind of times of change like this and times of transition. I think these are the big opportunities where we can do something. And so I think, to get there, we're going to need, from the prime minister on down, some political leadership that says, listen, this is important. We have to deal with this issue of not just digital identity, but kind of data sharing between jurisdictions. I mean, this came up during COVID as well, right? The inability to share health data between provinces was a huge problem, right? And just to say, like, this is a national priority that if we are going to be a functional state in the 21st century in 2025, you've got to be able to share data. You've got to be able to have kind of a digital ecosystem that citizens and government can participate in together. And we got to build that thing. Right. And so I think if that happens, it's going to take a few years for that to reflect itself in the rankings. But that, I think, is the beginning of us then being able to kind of really build that modern digital service ecosystem that I think people, frankly, expect, but they're not seeing right now.
I actually think the biggest opportunity, so I agree. I think the biggest opportunity isn't actually even that, though. I think the biggest opportunity is the current context with the United States right now, which is forcing this conversation of how, like, the realization that provinces are struggling to
Yes.
trade with each other. And there's this real push now politically that this is probably the most political that's been on this issue ever to get alignment across the provinces. And digital
Absolutely.
identity and digital credentials would enable that.
It could
So
be
maybe
part of it, right?
that is the drive that will get us there.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation that's happening right now about reducing interprovincial trade barriers, which has been stuck for decades,
Amazing.
as you said, right? Like never waste a good crisis, and we've got now this kind of existential threat, on the other side of the border that is really kind of, a lot of things that we assume to be true, we're not sure are true anymore. And so I think that opens up some real interesting possibilities to say, can we galvanize this moment to make some positive changes because of it?
Ryan, thank you so much for making time. You've changed my mind. I feel like it's less your fault now than I did at the beginning of the...
Ryan's redemption arc. Thank you so
There you
much.
go.
This is always fun, Derek. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate chatting about this. This is great.
No worries. Thanks so much, Ryan, and all the best.
Thank you.